we're going to talk about this example of microevolution, the changes in the adaptations in grass. I think it's easy. It goes back to biology, which hopefully you all remember and love. And we're going to take a look at this particular case where we're going to look at the alleles. If you remember genetics a little bit, of tall and short, and we're going to look at the height of the grass, okay, where tall is the dominant gene and short is the recessive gene. And we're going to look at the genotype and the phenotype. Now the phenotype is the outward expression, so in other words, is the plant tall or short, and the genotype is the actual alleles, the combination of either it's heterozygous or homozygous for tall, okay, or short. All right, so hopefully you're a little bit familiar with this. I don't have to go through all that. If not, you need to let me know and I'll go through it with you. But we're going to go do a Punnett Square here, which I'm sure you all love and just want to use over and over again in your lives. But the whole idea of a Punnett Square, okay, if you remember this, all right, when you're looking down at grass, and we're going, like I said, we're going to use the example of grass because it's an easy one to see, and we're going to look at heterozygous parents, okay, grass seed. All right, when you do a Punnett Square of heterozygous tall, so these are two plants that are tall, what happens to their offspring? If you look at them, genetically they're slightly different, whether they're homozygous or heterozygous for tall. But overall, you have 75% of your plants are tall for the phenotype, and 25% are short. Okay, so that's your phenotype. And so basically what you're looking at are plants grasses that try to grow tall, because tall is better competitively, because you can get the sunlight, because it's all an adaptation for getting energy. So the tall plants get the sunlight, the short plants unfortunately die out because they can't. So what happens is this part of the Punnett Square dies out, and you end up basically with a whole bunch of tall grass blades. Okay? Now let's add, and let's say that's been going on for generations and generations and generations of the grass. All right. Now let's add a selective pressure. Okay, or a change in the environment that we call selective pressure. And that selective pressure, in our case, is going to be some kind of grazing animal, like a cow or something. All right, so there's going to be a change in the environment through what we call selective pressure. And the reason why it's called selective pressure is because it's putting pressure on the plants, where before tall was the advantage. But now, because you have a grazing animals can get the tall plants first. It's easier. So now what you have in the Punnett Square, if we did the exact same Punnett Square, all right, you would have the two, let me just put this here real quick so you can see. This one, which was before the one that would die out because it wasn't competitive enough, now this is the one that survives, because it's short. So the tall grass is actually a negative. So now let's go through another generation here, and we are simplifying this beyond belief, but it'll give you some perspective, where now you can have the homozygous recessive gene, or short grass, with the tall grass mating. And what do you end up with? In this case, too tall, but then also too short. So you have 50% tall and 50% short. But now the advantage is for the short. So the talls are going to die out because they're the ones that are going to get eaten first. And if the talls die out, I'll go one more down here. And we'll go whoop, all the way down. What are you going to have left mostly? Is a Punnett Square that looks like this, where you end up with 100% short. and that 100% short. Now you've seen the plant evolve or change in this process called microevolution through natural selection. It now has pushed towards short. So this grass, which was once tall, now because of selective pressure, a grazing animal, now becomes a short plant. And that's what we call microevolution. We see it every day. We use microevolution all the time in our plants and our food, okay, and everything like that. Now, in another example, just to show you that it's not just me and with grass, tall grass, there's a famous example of a water flea. Now, I put this on sideways. I apologize, but it was the best way to make the chart so you can see it, okay. This small amphipod, okay, when the parents would mate, okay, you would end up with a larger one and a smaller one, where the larger ones were the dominant, the smaller ones were the recessive, okay. But the problem was the larger ones, the larger offspring, were the ones that were more easily found by fish, and so they were the ones that were eaten. Okay, and so now the survivors become the parents for the next generation. And when they mated, you had more small ones and one large, in this case about 25% large, which were the ones that got eaten. And so what do you have? Only the small ones reproduce. And then you end up with the adaptation of these particular species getting smaller and smaller, and now they're very small. All because of selective pressure. In this case, the selective pressure was your fish. All right, so hopefully that concept makes sense to you. You can understand it, and we can work with that as we move on. Now, there are other ways for this to take place, and we're going to go through a few of them here. We're going to get into a lot of material, a lot of complicated material. Please go back and review if you need to. Okay, but this microevolution can be attained in many ways, and another way or another set of ways is through these mutations, okay, or what we call the founder effect, or demographic bottlenecking, or even the genetic shift. Okay, mutations, I think, are what you're used to and what you usually talk about when you talk about animals evolving or going through natural selection, where mutation becomes becomes the advantage for a species. Most mutations never have a chance to enter the gene pool because they're fatal. But there's a very small percentage, and we're talking very small percent, less than 1/10%, that actually could be beneficial to help an organism survive. And if that's the case, the mutation, which now is better for fitness for the species, okay, becomes part of the genetic makeup. So mutation causes a species to change, and it could be color of the species or whatever. But usually mutations are negative, and they do not become part of the gene pool, but sometimes they are positive, and they can. All right, the second one on here is the genetic drift. All right, and I'll write this bigger so you can see it. This concept of genetic drift, which I'll show you here in a little bit again, is when you have a large population of species, okay, or I'm sorry, of individuals within a species, and some reason over time that population shrinks, whether it's because of a climate change or because of some kind of outside pressure based on the ecosystem, but you get fewer, and then when you get a smaller number, your chances of changing the genetic makeup increases. So in a large population, okay, there's so much randomness that you're going to continue basically with the same phenotypes, okay, the same outward expression of the genetic makeup, and the genotypes don't really change. But when you switch that to a small population, for whatever reason happened, okay, the chances are that a particular trait may phase out. In this case, the black mouse phases out, and you get a change or a drift in the genetic makeup. All right. The next one's called a bottleneck effect. I'll show you another chart of this, but a bottleneck is almost the same thing. But in a bottleneck, a demographic bottleneck is when some kind of catastrophe occurs within the ecosystem, like a drought or a flood or something, and there's only a few make it through and survive. All right, and by chance, those few may be the extremes within the genetic makeup. And then what happens is those are the only ones that are able to reproduce, and you become a new genetic makeup of the species. All right, and so it's called a geographic bottleneck, or demographic, sorry, bottleneck. And finally, the founder's effect. All right, and the effect on this population can be dramatic. And what happens here, and we're going to talk about this, is when the mainland, you have all the huge variety of genetic material within the species. You have a lot of diversity within the gene pool, and then some of those species end up going to another location, which is geographically isolated. And whatever species makes it to that other location may be slightly genetically different, maybe on the extremes. And then that species then continues to reproduce, and you get a different species, or not different species, but a different genetic makeup of that species. So it usually happens on islands when birds get blown in a storm onto an island is the most common, or an animal gets washed off of the mainland onto an island. It's called the founder effect, and that can then create a new species. All right, those new species are then fundamentally different from the species on the mainland, which makes them endemic, which makes them different, which makes them super important to preserve. All right, because they've found their own niche in their environment, and they've become an important aspect in the environment on the island. So much to do, so much to go through here. All right, just some quick examples of this. Here's the idea of the founder effect, okay, where you have a population on the mainland. Whoops, sorry, I'll put that back. There we go. You have a population on the mainland, there we go, where one of the individuals gets put onto an island or another location, and now where here you had some diversity of, say, yellow in this case, all of these are red. You have no yellow. Just by chance, this particular genetic makeup moved. All right, that's called the founder effect, which I think you're familiar with now. Okay, and let's go. Let me just give you another example, another way of going through a geographic bottleneck. I just love this example. In a geographic bottleneck, you end up with, or you start off with a very diverse original population. Something happens where there's a catastrophic event, and even though you had tremendous diversity, only a few survivors. It just so happens that those survivors are not as genetically diverse. They're different. Like I said, they may be the extremes, and then those extremes then create a new population, which is now different from your original population. Okay? And with that, you now have at least some basic idea of some of the dynamics within a population and the way these species have evolved into the diversity that we have. Okay? It's just this whole idea where you can have these changes that occur, and the species have changed, and that's what creates this biodiversity. That's one of the reasons why we have so much biodiversity. All right, the idea of the bottleneck, where only certain, in this case, you can actually see the genotypes right here in the middle that survive the bottleneck, and then genetically the species are different from what it was originally. And so now you create two different species, and that's what creates this biodiversity on this planet. And it's just an amazing process that we need to know the background of so that we understand the whole idea of this diversity and how important it is on our planet. Okay, and then finally the genetic drift, where one particular species, where you have certain members which whose traits, I should say, are not well suited for survival or reproduction. They end up dying out of the population, so slowly your population changes. Okay, and it creates a new population where this genetic material is now gone from your population, and you shifted genetically to a new population. And that is the basics behind biodiversity, or the reasons behind the biodiversity on our planet. When we talk about evolution on a small scale, microevolution. All right. The next step is to look at it on a large scale and through a process called natural selection, which we shall get to next.